Welcome to the How I Color Eyes tutorial. If you haven't already, I recommend also watching the previous tutorial where I go over how I draw eyes, since we are only going to focus on coloring. Okay, let's get started. I like to start with at least a base skin tone already laid down on the layer below the line art. Because when I paint the eye whites, I use a softer brush that lets the base skin tone show through a little bit. So on the same layer as the skin tone, I use a soft brush to paint in a grayish pinkish color. Eye whites are never fully white, at least not in any sort of semi-realistic style. If you get super cartoony, then yeah, maybe you will draw the eye whites white, but generally eye whites are never fully white, and this is super important, especially if you really want the eye shine to pop later on. The eye whites are more gray than anything else. I like to leave a little bit more of the skin tone showing through softly at the edges of the eye whites. This helps both indicate a little bit of shading before we get into that step, so it's kind of like a pre-shading, but also it just helps them feel a little bit more part of the character, like the eyes really belong to the character. Now let's move on to irises. For these first eyes, let's go with brown. When I choose a base color for irises, I try to not choose any color that's too saturated. If you start too saturated, you don't give yourself enough room to add any interesting saturated flecks of color later if you wanted to add something like that. There needs to be a contrast, not just with how light and dark colors are, but also how much saturation and desaturation there is. So I like to start off in a very medium area for the base color of the irises. For this next part, it's very important to remember what we talked about in the previous How to Draw Eyes tutorial, which is the iris is shaped like a bowl. This bowl actually dips into the eyeball. That is super important when deciding where will be lighter and darker in the actual iris, since the light and dark depends on where the light source is and how it is affecting the bowl. Let's put the light source in the upper screen right. That means that the iris will actually be darker on the side that is closest to the light source, and it will be lighter on the side that is furthest away from the light source. Remember, the irises are indented into the eye, so the light is actually hitting most on the opposite side of the iris. For indicating this, I usually start off with a soft airbrush to get the general colors in. So I'm going to use the magic wand tool to select the iris flat color that we have here. And now I'm going to use a soft airbrush to start gently painting in the darker color and the lighter color, just as kind of a soft gradient. As far as how I choose the colors, my typical rule is to go slightly darker and more saturated for the dark part, and then slightly lighter and less saturated for the light part. But as you can see here, I play around with it a little bit. Especially once I have the two main tones in, then I can come in and play around a little bit. Sometimes, especially with something like eyes, which have a lot of color variety, even inside the eye and the iris itself, I will play around with adding different colors in different areas of the eyes. Like maybe there's a little bit more red in one area, maybe in another area it's a little bit more yellow. Eyes are this type of thing where, you have a general base rule, which is like darker closer to the light source, lighter further away from the light source, and then kind of inside of that general rule, you can play around a little bit with what the actual tones and tints of the colors will be. For the next step, we do my typical shading hack. Make a new layer and switch the layer mode to hard light. Then choose a grayish color, a dark grayish color. I went with a dark grayish red color for this first set of eyes, but you can play around with how you want to actually tint your shadows. I get asked a lot by people who want the exact right answer when it comes to colors and color palettes and shadow colors, but for me, that just is not how I work most of the time. I like to play around and experiment with what colors might look like by actually trying them out and experimenting, especially since I'm using layer modes in this hard light layer mode. Don't be afraid to try stuff out, guys, and there's no exact right answer. There just isn't. So it's fun to me to be able to experiment and see what kind of looks you can get. Okay, sorry for the little tangent. Let's move on. I use a hard round brush to paint in some quick hard shadows on that hard light layer mode. These shadows on the eyes are shadows that will actually rest on top of the eyeball, which is kind of opposite of the iris. Remember in the last tutorial how we talked about how the basic anatomy of an eye, how the iris scoops in, but the eyeball itself bulges out, so they're like opposite of each other. And these shadows rest on top of the eyeball that is bulging out, the actual sphere. Now I'm going to adjust the color of the line art a little to darken the eyelashes. I just do this by toggling the Lock Transparent Pixels button for the line art layer, and then I paint black on top of the eyelashes section of the line art. And now is one of my favorite steps, the eye shine. So the eye shine shape can be a variety of shapes, but it kind of depends on the shape of the actual light source. You can go with a really simple round shape to make it easy, but I've been kind of enjoying a little bit more of a curvy blobby kind of shape that helps indicate how spherical the surface of the eye is, because the kind of blobby elongated shape has to curve on top of the eyeball for it to look right. If the eye shine is close enough to the top of the eye, you can take a little hard eraser to erase a couple notches from the top of the eye shine to indicate the shadow of the eyelashes. It's kind of a fun little handy tip. And now for another little stylistic thing that I have been super into lately. If you want the eye shine to really pop, but you don't want to make the eye shine just bigger and bigger and bigger. So one way that I like to make the eye shine pop is to actually take a darker color, sometimes even straight up like black or almost black, and do a very small outline around the eye shine. Now, this is obviously not realistic, but it is a fun style choice that helps the highlight really pop. Speaking of eye shines, this part should look super familiar from the eye tutorial that I did a long time ago, I guess a couple years ago. This is the adding kind of a glossy sheen to the eyes. So you're going to create a new layer on top of everything. Change the layer mode to screen. Use a very light color that is mostly white but might have a slightly blue tint. Then, with the lasso tool, select an arc across the top of both eyes. Then, with a soft airbrush, brush across the bottom of the arc with that light color. You should be creating a hard line at the bottom of the arc that gradients up to transparent towards the top of the eyes. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now deselect and use another semi-soft brush. Start erasing a bit of this eye shine and perfecting the shape and the transparency until you get something you are satisfied with. I'm going to go with something that's a little bit more subtle. You could make this eye shine really, really bold if you wanted, but I tend to like a little bit more of the subtle look. I just want to give a hint that the eyes are a glossy sort of texture. I guess another thing to note is that you don't have to add this sort of extra shine or gloss on the eyes. It's especially not necessary in every scene, but it's a nice touch sometimes. Now, if you'd like to take the eyes even further, you can create a new layer to start painting in more details. It's at this stage where I'm going to start focusing on adding a little thickness to the eyelids with a pinker color, a pinker skinish sort of color, to add a little bit of that thickness between the bottom eyelash line and the actual eyeball. And I'm also going to start adding some more details and shapes into the actual irises. I may even add some extra shininess to show a little bit of moisture in the eyes, and this is pretty easy to do. It's mostly with either a white or an almost white color with a very small hard brush that you can just start adding in maybe a little thin white line, maybe along the bottom of the eyes, maybe in the little corners of the eyes, starting to add those really small detailed highlights. And then I'm also going to add a little bit, at least roughly, some more shadows just to have a little bit more depth in the eyes as well. Whenever we get to the paint over stage, I think it's important to be a little bit brave and accept that you may be painting over or outside of some of the lines that you had originally drawn. It's okay. It's okay to paint over lines that you've already drawn. You're never locked into anything. You can always change it and paint over it, and that's what this stage is for. This is the part that can really help refine and take your pieces to the next level. And when it comes to painting little details in the irises, I don't always get super detailed, but sometimes it's nice, especially if you're working on a close-up piece. So remember that irises have lines that kind of look like rays. From the front view, like this, they look kind of like sun rays, just sort of coming out from the center. But when we get into a more angled view, using these details can be really helpful in showing the actual shape and depth of the iris because they follow along the bottom of that iris bowl. Okay, that's the basic steps of how I paint eyes straight on. I do want to show you some more eye colors, although the steps are basically the same. But we'll do that at the end of the tutorial, or at least later on in the tutorial. Next, I want to get to showing you guys how I paint eyes from an angle to really sell the depth of the eyes. This is all the same steps, but now we really need to think about that bowl that the iris is shaped like. So starting with the base skin tone, filling in the eye whites, or maybe we should call them eye grays, with a soft brush, and then filling in the irises. We'll go with a gray-blue color for these eyes. Using the magic wand, select the iris. In the drawing, I already indicated that the eye shine is going to be on the screen left side of the eye, so that's where I think the light source is. That means that the lighter color goes on the opposite side of the iris, and the darker color goes on the side of the iris that is closest to the eye shine. And doing that already makes the eyes look like they have a lot of depth, even with this just soft airbrush, almost no detail. Now I'm going to block in my shadows with the hard light layer and use a dark grayish pinkish shadows. Remember, the shadows should help indicate that the eyeball is round, just like if you were painting a plain sphere that is stuck into a hole. That's kind of what an eyeball is. It's a sphere in a socket. Now that some basic shadows are in, I want to try and use those ray details in the iris to help emphasize the bowl shape of the iris. Back to the base color layer. I'm just color picking some of the iris colors that I already have in there, and I paint in some of those just ray shapes. And I'm using the Walter Wet watercolor brush. I will include it, and then I'm kind of switching around. It doesn't really matter too much, just whatever feels good to you and whatever look you like for these kinds of shapes and sort of detail painting. But I'm always keeping in mind the bowl shape, so these rays have a slight curve to them as they angle from the edge of the iris down to the pupil. It's coming from the edge of the bowl down to the center of the bowl. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this so far. In this drawing, I indicated the thickness of the top eyelid since this character's head was angled up, so I'm going to color that in with a pinkish flesh tone. This is just on the base layer again. It should basically match the pinkish color that's in the corner of the eye as well. Now create a new layer and let's fill in, and this is on top of everything, let's fill in the highlight, which should follow the surface of the eyeball, not the bowl of the iris. I'm going to also do a little paint over while I'm here, mostly just to clean up the painting a little bit. And we have eyes from an angle. I'm pretty happy with how much depth they look like they have. Let's move on to do a quick painting of a profile eye, basically. The same steps to get the base in and all the same principles apply. The pupil, however, is set back into the iris even further when you're looking at it from this angle. Do not, I repeat, do not put the pupil in the front of the eyeball. It looks super unnatural when the pupil is in the front of the eye. I remember I talked about this in the last tutorial. When you see like really crazy contacts lenses, they don't just look super crazy because of the color. They usually look crazy because it makes it look like the pupil is on top of the eye and not set back into the iris. It's super weird and unnerving and it doesn't look right. So don't do that. Put it back there. It should be a very like thin oval when it's from this angle, and it should be almost at the edge of the iris bowl. So now that I've pounded that into your brains, the line art was a little thicker for this one. So in the paint over, I'm just going to paint the lighter color of the iris on top of some of the line art that is at the front of the eye. That way we can bring that lighter color forward and hopefully add a little bit more depth to the eye. So now you know my process for painting eyes. The process and principles are basically the same for other angles and colors, but I want to give you some extra examples to watch. Something that I didn't mention yet was the pupil color. When it comes to the pupil, the most realistic would be to go with like a black pupil, but since we are playing with semi-realism, you can play with other colors to add maybe more personality or a different feeling. Or maybe other colors just look cool. Sometimes I will use a dark gray, but other times I will actually play with a kind of red eye look, like you would get from old flash photos. And other times I will play with blues or purples or, any other color. Sometimes it's even like a lighter color than you would expect, and it can make the character look a little bit more eerie or magical. I feel like playing with the color of the pupil and the style of the pupils is a really good way to just experiment and play with different styles and looks. So I encourage you to try out different pupil colors and see if anything fun comes out of it. Anywho, I'm going to let these examples play for you with some music. Thank you so much for watching, you guys, and thank you for learning to color eyes with me today. And of course, thank you so much for supporting my work. If you are interested in more tutorials, tons of rewards, and helping support this channel and my work and getting lots of goodies and resources, you can pop on over to my Patreon. It's kind of what helps keep all of this running. So thank you so much. Huge shout out to patrons. Couldn't do this without them. So thank you so much. See you next time, guys. Bye!